Chapter 1. The Setup. The night was thick with heat, the kind that clung to your skin and settled deep into your bones. Ricky Bones Chavez leaned against the hood of his beat-up car, his eyes scanning the run-down warehouse in front of him. His cigarette burned low, barely illuminating the hard lines of his face. He flicked the ash off the tip and sighed, already regretting that he'd let his brother rope him into this. It was supposed to be simple, a small job, just like Hector had promised. A quick shakedown to remind some low-level gangster who owed who. Ricky was no stranger to violence, but he'd spent years perfecting the art of control. In, out, no mess. Hector was a different beast altogether, wild, unpredictable, and always ready to push things further than they needed to go. He heard the heavy thud of boots behind him, and without looking back, he knew it was Hector. The younger Chavez was always in a rush, as if every minute that passed without chaos was a minute wasted. Ricky glanced down at his watch. Too late to back out now. "Ready, Bones?" Hector's voice came with a crooked grin, the excitement practically vibrating off him. He bounced on the balls of his feet like a boxer warming up for a fight. Ricky took another drag from his cigarette, his eyes narrowing. "Just keep it clean this time. We're not here to make a scene." Hector scoffed, adjusting the grip on the crowbar he was carrying like it was an extension of his arm. "Relax, big brother. Just a little scared, that's all. The guy owes us. Gonna remind him who he's messing with." Ricky knew that look in Hector's eyes, that glint of madness that always spelled trouble. But family was family, and no matter how many times Hector dragged him into these situations, Ricky always stayed. Cleaning up Hector's messes had become second nature. They approached the warehouse door, the smell of motor oil and stale sweat hanging in the air. Ricky kept his steps steady, calm, while Hector practically barreled forward, knocking on the rusted metal door like it was a game. The door creaked open, revealing Tony Garza, a scrawny gangster with a greasy mustache and a fake gold chain around his neck. His eyes flickered nervously between the two brothers. "Chavez," Tony muttered, trying to hide his fear. "What are you doing here?" Hector wasted no time shoving his way inside. Ricky followed at a slower pace, eyes scanning the room, making sure there were no surprises. "We're here to collect," Hector said, his voice low but dangerous. "You're late, Tony. Way too late." Tony's eyes darted from Hector to Ricky, the panic setting in. I've got the money. I just need a few more days, man. You know how business is, slow as shit right now." Hector's grin widened, and Ricky felt the tension in the air thicken. This wasn't going to end well. He stepped forward, placing a hand on Hector's shoulder, trying to ground him. "Hector, let's talk." But Hector was already beyond talking. He slammed the crowbar onto the table with a loud thwack, making Tony jump. "You think we're playing games here, Tony? You're gonna bleed if you don't pay up. Simple as that." Tony backed up against the wall, his hands raised defensively. "Look, I'll get the money, I swear. Just give me until tomorrow." Before Ricky could stop him, Hector lunged. The crowbar swung wide, catching Tony across the jaw with a sickening crack. Blood sprayed, and Tony collapsed to the floor, moaning in agony. "Jesus, Hector," Ricky growled, grabbing his brother by the collar and pulling him back. "What the hell are you doing?" Hector wiped the blood from his cheek with the back of his hand, that wild glint in his eyes burning brighter. "Teaching the little shit a lesson, what does it look like?" Ricky's jaw clenched. This was not how it was supposed to go. Tony wasn't some street thug. He had connections. People would notice if he went missing or showed up dead. Tony coughed, spitting blood onto the concrete floor. His breath came in ragged gasps. You don't know who you're messing with," he croaked. Ricky bent down, grabbing Tony by the shirt and pulling him close. "Who's backing you?" Tony's bloodied face twisted into a grim smile. "Santini. I work for Marcus Santini." The name hit Ricky like a punch to the gut. Santini was one of the biggest players in the city's underworld. Getting on his bad side was a death sentence. And now, thanks to Hector, they were on that very path. "Hector, we're done," Ricky said, pulling Tony to his feet. "We're getting out of here." But before he could drag Tony away, Hector moved like lightning. He slammed the crowbar down again, this time with enough force to cave in Tony's skull. Blood splattered across the floor, pooling around the lifeless body. Ricky stared at the mess, his mind racing. This wasn't just a botched job. This was a death wish. Hector stood there, breathing heavy, a twisted smile on his face like he'd just done the world a favor. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Ricky shouted, grabbing Hector by the collar. "Do you even understand what you just did?" Hector shrugged, wiping the blood off his hands with a rag. "Relax, we'll clean it up." Ricky pushed him away, his stomach churning. There was no cleaning this up. Not when Marcus Santini was involved. He needed to think, needed to get them out of this mess before it buried them both. His phone buzzed in his pocket. The name on the screen made his heart skip a beat. Sasha McQueen. He hadn't spoken to her in years, not since they'd both walked away from the life, or at least tried to. But if she was calling now, it couldn't be good. "Ricky," her voice purred through the phone, the same smooth, seductive tone that always made him uneasy. "I heard you had a little incident tonight." Ricky's pulse quickened. "How the hell do you know that?" "I know things," she said, almost teasing. "And I know you're in deep shit. But lucky for you, I've got a way out. If you're willing to take a risk." Ricky glanced down at Tony's mangled body, at Hector's still bloody hands. He didn't have many options. "What's the job, Sasha?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Ricky could hear the faint sound of jazz music playing in the background. Sasha always had a flair for the dramatic. "Let's just say it's worth your time," she said finally, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Meet me at the Blue Room tomorrow night. We'll talk." Ricky hung up the phone, a pit forming in his stomach. Whatever Sasha was into, it wasn't going to be clean. But with Santini breathing down their necks, clean wasn't an option anymore. He turned to Hector, who was still admiring his handiwork. "We need to move, now." Hector shrugged. "Where to?" Ricky flicked his cigarette to the ground, crushing it under his boot. "We're going to see Sasha." As they made their way out of the warehouse, Ricky couldn't shake the feeling that this job, this mess, was going to be the one that finally pulled him under. And Hector wouldn't stop until they were both drowning. Chapter 2, Smoke and Mirrors. The neon lights of the city bled into the night sky, casting the streets in an electric glow. Somewhere in the depths of that glittering chaos, Frankie Silk Marlowe adjusted his cufflinks, checking his reflection in the cracked mirror of the cramped apartment they were renting. He looked good, too good, as usual. The sharp gray suit, the silk tie, the hair slicked back just right. He had an air of polished confidence that made people trust him. But Frankie didn't trust anyone, especially not tonight. Behind him, Jackie Red O'Hara paced the floor like a caged animal. Her eyes darting between the cards spread out on the table and the clock ticking on the wall. Jackie didn't do nerves, but she wasn't stupid either. When the stakes got this high, even the most seasoned grifters felt the pressure. "You know we're walking a tightrope with no net here, right?" Jackie muttered, her fingers brushing over the edge of the deck, her mind spinning with calculations and contingencies. Frankie smirked, glancing over his shoulder. "Relax, darling. That's why we're so good at what we do. Tightropes are our specialty." He flashed her that $1,000,000 smile, the one that had gotten them out of trouble more times than either of them could count. But Jackie wasn't buying it tonight. She shot him a look that could cut glass. "You think your charm's gonna save us if this goes sideways? Because we're dealing with more than just small-time crooks. This guy, he's connected. Really connected." "That's what makes it fun," Frankie said, finally turning away from the mirror and taking a seat at the table. He picked up a card, twirling it between his fingers with practiced ease. "You know the game, Jackie. If you don't play with fire, you never feel the heat." Jackie shook her head, rolling her eyes. "Sometimes I wonder why I even bother sticking around with you, Frankie." "Because you love the thrill as much as I do," he replied without missing a beat. "And let's not forget, you're the best in the business when it comes to running the game. Tonight's just another job. We're gonna fleece this guy, take his cash, and disappear like smoke. Easy." But they both knew it wasn't easy. Not this time. Their Mark, Louis Marchetti, wasn't just some rich fool with more money than sense. He was a businessman, one who dipped his fingers into some very dirty dealings. And Frankie hadn't told Jackie the whole truth. Marchetti wasn't just connected to the underworld, he was a key player in Marcus Santini's operation. If things went wrong, it wouldn't just be their livelihoods on the line, it'd be their lives. Still, Frankie had a plan. He always did. That's what he was good at. Slick words, quick hands, and the ability to adapt when things went to hell. He leaned back in his chair, hands behind his head, as Jackie laid out the deck in front of him. "You remember the signals, right?" Jackie asked, her voice all business now. "Marchetti's not a chump." He's gonna be watching everyone at that table like a hawk. Frankie nodded, flashing her a wink. Left hand scratch for the high card, right hand for low. Shift in the chair means I'm bluffing. Easy as pie. Don't get cocky, Frankie, she warned. You get too confident, and you're gonna slip. He grinned, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a low murmur. Jackie, darling, slipping is for amateurs. We've been doing this dance for years. I know how to keep my feet steady. Jackie pursed her lips but didn't argue. Frankie might have been cocky, but he wasn't wrong. He was one of the best at the long con, and together, they were unbeatable. Still, something about this one felt off. Like there were too many moving parts, too many variables they couldn't control. As if reading her thoughts, Frankie tapped his fingers on the table, the smooth rhythm soothing him as much as it irritated Jackie. You ever wonder if we're ever gonna go too far, Jackie? Push one of these marks a little too hard and end up buried in some ditch out in the desert? She arched an eyebrow at him, crossing her arms. You getting cold feet, Silk? Because last time I checked, you were the one always pulling us into deeper shit. Frankie chuckled, his smile never faltering. Nah, just thinking. It's good to keep an eye on the edge, make sure we don't fall off. Jackie shook her head, stepping away from the table and pacing again. Look, we're set for tonight. I've got the fake chips prepped, the deck marked. We just need to keep them on the hook long enough to take what we need. Then we're out of here. Frankie stood, stretching his arms and loosening his shoulders. You know, I love it when you talk like that. Gets me all excited. He walked over to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. But seriously, you've got this. We've got this. It's just another night. Jackie eyed him warily. You sure Marchetti won't smell a rat? Frankie gave her a slow grin, pulling a small envelope from his jacket pocket and holding it up. I slipped him just enough info to get him hungry. He thinks he's the one doing the con, and that's why we're gonna win. Jackie's eyes flicked to the envelope. You gave him a piece of the stash? Just a taste, Frankie said, his grin widening. Enough to get him thinking he's in control. But we both know who's really holding the cards. She didn't like playing games with people like Marchetti, but she also couldn't resist the allure of a big score. And Frankie? Frankie lived for the con. He thrived on the thrill of deception, the fine line between winning and losing it all. All right, she said finally. Let's do this. Later that night, the underground poker game was in full swing. The air was thick with cigar smoke, and the soft clink of poker chips echoed through the dimly lit room. Frankie leaned back in his chair, his suit immaculate, his face the picture of calm. Across from him, Louis Marchetti sat with a smug grin, his eyes flicking between his cards and Frankie's relaxed posture. Everything was going according to plan. Jackie moved between tables, serving drinks and keeping an eye on the action. She was the ghost in the room, making sure everything ran smoothly while blending into the background. The deck was marked, the chips were rigged, and all they had to do was make sure Marchetti didn't realize he was being taken for a ride until it was too late. Looks like I'm all in, Frankie said with a smirk, pushing a pile of chips forward. Feeling lucky tonight, Louis? Marchetti chuckled, his eyes gleaming with greed. Luck's got nothing to do with it, Marlowe. It's all about skill, and I'm about to teach you a lesson. Frankie gave him that same easy smile, the one that made people underestimate him. We'll see about that. But as the cards hit the table, Frankie couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach. Something wasn't right. He glanced at Jackie, who caught his eye and gave a slight nod. Everything was still under control, but there was an edge in the air, like the calm before a storm. As the final card was dealt, Frankie felt a bead of sweat slide down his back. He kept his cool, but inside every nerve was on high alert. Something was off, and he couldn't quite place what it was. Then Marchetti laughed, a low, sinister sound that sent a chill down Frankie's spine. You know, Marlowe, Marchetti said, leaning back in his chair. I've been hearing things, rumors about you, about this game. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? Frankie's smile didn't falter, but his heart skipped a beat. Rumors? Come on, Louis, we're all friends here. Marchetti's eyes narrowed, and suddenly, the mood in the room shifted. The casual, easygoing atmosphere evaporated, replaced by something much more dangerous. You better hope we are, Marlowe, Marchetti said, his voice dripping with menace. Because if I find out you're playing me, Frankie chuckled, raising his hands in mock surrender. Louis, you wound me. This is all just a game, remember? No hard feelings. but the look in Marchetti's eyes told him there were plenty of hard feelings, especially if things didn't go the way Marchetti expected. Frankie could feel the tension rising, the stakes getting higher with every second. "Time to wrap this up," Jackie's voice whispered in his ear through the hidden earpiece she'd slipped him earlier. "We're running out of room to breathe." Frankie took a deep breath, his mind racing. They needed to close the con, take the money, and get out. But something told him they weren't going to slip away unnoticed tonight. As he pushed the final stack of chips toward the center of the table, Frankie's smile widened. He could feel the end coming. He just didn't know whose end it would be. Chapter 3. Old Flames, New Problems. The bar was the kind of place where secrets died with the drunks. The lights were dim, casting everything in a perpetual haze of cheap whiskey and cigarette smoke, and the jukebox hummed low in the background, a forgotten song on repeat. Sasha McQueen slid into a booth at the far end of the room, the leather cracked beneath her fingers, a perfect match for the peeling walls and the faded souls nursing their drinks. Her eyes scanned the room as she waited, taking in the regulars who looked as beaten down as the furniture. Sasha didn't belong in places like this, not anymore, but she knew that's why Ricky would come. He'd expect her to be there, like some ghost from his past he hadn't managed to shake. She was good at haunting people. The door creaked open, letting in a brief gust of the city's night air before it was swallowed up by the stale warmth of the bar. Sasha's lips curved into a slow smile as Ricky Bone Chavez stepped inside, his silhouette sharp against the soft glow of neon outside. He hadn't changed much. The same brooding eyes, the same steady stride, though there was something heavier about the way he moved now, like the years of being in this life were finally starting to show. Ricky spotted her almost immediately. There was always an invisible tether between them, something neither could sever, no matter how hard they tried. He made his way over, shoulders tense, jaw set, like he was already bracing himself for whatever game Sasha had planned. "You're late," she said, her voice velvet and cigarette smoke, the kind of sound that could lull a man into thinking he was safe when he wasn't. Sasha took a slow sip from her drink, her eyes never leaving his. Ricky slid into the booth across from her, his expression unreadable. He looked at her with the caution of a man who'd been burned before, because he had. "Yeah, well, I wasn't sure I was gonna show at all." Sasha tilted her head, letting his words hang in the air for a moment before she responded. "But you did." Ricky's gaze flicked around the bar, taking in the exits, the shadows. He hadn't even ordered a drink yet, and he already looked like he was thinking about leaving. But that was Ricky, always halfway out the door, always running from something. She loved that about him. "Let's cut to the chase, Sasha," he said, leaning back in the booth, arms crossed. "What do you want?" Sasha smiled. God, she'd missed this, missed him, the way he never let his guard down, the way every word from his mouth was edged in suspicion. It was part of what had drawn her to him in the first place, but tonight wasn't about nostalgia. She set her glass down gently, leaning forward just enough to close the distance between them, her voice lowering to that seductive, dangerous tone she used when she wanted something. "I've got a job, and I need you, Ricky." Ricky's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "I'm out, Sasha. I told you that. No more jobs, no more killing. I'm done." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "You really think you're done? You're never done, Ricky. Not in this world. Not with the blood on your hands." Ricky's expression darkened. She'd hit a nerve. He still carried the weight of every life he'd taken, even if he tried to hide it behind that cold, professional exterior. But Sasha knew Ricky better than he knew himself. She always knew where to press. "It's not that simple," Sasha continued, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "This job, it's different. It's not about killing. It's about money and freedom." "Freedom?" Ricky scoffed, but there was a flicker of interest in his eyes, even if he tried to bury it. "Since when do you care about freedom?" "Since now," Sasha said, her voice soft but firm. "Look, Ricky, I know what you've been through. I know you want out, but this job, this could be your way. One last job and we're done. We walk away clean." Ricky watched her carefully, his eyes searching for the lie. "What kind of job?" Sasha leaned in closer, her breath warm against his skin. "Diamonds, a stash worth more than either of us could dream. And they're just sitting there, waiting to be taken." "Diamonds," Ricky repeated, suspicion lacing his words. "Where?" Sasha's smile widened. She had him now. "It's connected to Hector's mess, the guy he killed. He was holding onto something for Marcus Santini. Ricky's face tightened at the mention of Hector's name. His brother had always been trouble, but this time, he'd dragged Ricky into something deeper than he could have ever anticipated. Santini? Ricky's voice was low, dangerous now. You want me to steal from Santini? Sasha's eyes flashed with something, excitement, danger, maybe both. Why not? Santini's not invincible. He's powerful, sure, but he's not untouchable, and you know that better than anyone. Ricky's jaw clenched. What's your angle, Sasha? What aren't you telling me? She leaned back, crossing her legs under the table, her smile shifting into something more serious. My angle is that I need you, Ricky. I need someone I can trust to pull this off, and you're the only one I trust with this. There's a lot more at play than just diamonds, but I'll fill you in when you're in. Ricky looked down at his hands, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He wanted to say no, to walk out and never look back, but something about Sasha always pulled him back in. Maybe it was the way she could still get under his skin, or maybe it was because deep down he knew she was right. He wasn't done. He never would be. I'm not doing this for Hector, Ricky said quietly, his eyes meeting hers again. Sasha nodded, her voice softer now. I know, you're doing this for you. There was a moment of silence between them, heavy with unspoken history, with the things they'd done, the things they'd said to each other. Ricky could feel the pull, the inevitable slide back into her world, their world, a world he'd tried so hard to leave behind. And what's in this for you? Ricky asked, his voice edged with suspicion. Sasha's smile returned, slower this time, like a secret she wasn't quite ready to reveal. Let's just say, I've got my reasons, and if we play this right, we'll both walk away with what we want. Ricky shook his head, exhaling deeply. He knew better than to trust her fully, but he also knew that whatever she was wrapped up in, he was already halfway in himself. All right, he said, his voice resigned. I'm in, but if you're lying to me, Sasha, I'm not, she interrupted, her eyes locking onto his, deadly serious now. I need this as much as you do. Ricky nodded, pushing himself up from the booth. He paused, looking down at her, and for a moment he almost asked her why she'd come back to him after all these years. But he didn't. The answer wouldn't have mattered anyway. As Ricky turned to leave, Sasha's voice cut through the haze of the bar. Oh, one more thing, Ricky. He stopped, glancing back at her over his shoulder. Marcus Santini's more involved in this than you realize, she said, her voice low, dangerous. And he doesn't let anyone walk away easily. Ricky stared at her for a long moment, the weight of her words settling over him like a shroud. Neither do I, he said quietly, before disappearing into the smoky bar, leaving Sasha alone in the booth, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the table. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Everything was in motion now, and there was no going back. Chapter 4, The Poker Con. Jackie Red O'Hara watched the players with a predator's eyes, each movement, each glance telling her a different story. It was always like this with the big poker games. People gave themselves away without even knowing it. Sweat forming on their brow, fingers drumming nervously on the table, a glance too quick to the exit. She could read them all, except Frankie. He was the wild card, always had been. Right now he was holding court like a king, all smooth smiles and sharp words, dealing the cards with the flair of a magician. The room was dimly lit, filled with the faint smell of cigar smoke and whiskey. It was a perfect setup, an exclusive underground poker game, hosted in a back room of a forgotten nightclub on the city's fringes. The Mark, a slick businessman named Bruno Marquez, sat across from Frankie, his eyes hungry for the win. His fingers were laced with thick gold rings, a cheap attempt at looking powerful. Jackie knew men like him. They thought money and status made them invincible, but tonight he was a lamb being led to slaughter. And she and Frankie? They were the wolves. She walked the perimeter, keeping an eye on the room's logistics. Security was tight but subtle. 2 guys by the door, arms crossed, guns tucked out of sight but ready to be drawn at the first sign of trouble. They were locals, hired muscle who didn't ask questions. They didn't know the game was rigged in Frankie's favor, and neither did Bruno. That was the beauty of it. Everything smooth? Frankie's voice cut through the haze, calm and effortless as ever. He didn't even glance her way, his attention still on the game, his hand lingering over the deck of cards. Smooth as silk, Jackie replied, giving him a quick nod. He's buying it. Frankie smiled, but his eyes were focused on the cards in front of him. Good. We'll let him win the next round, get his confidence up, then we clean him out. Jackie couldn't help but smile. Frankie had always been a master at this, pushing people just far enough until they were on the brink of collapse, then snatching everything away before they even realized they'd lost. But as she scanned the room again, something felt off, a weight in the air she couldn't quite place. It was too quiet, too perfect. Years of running cons had sharpened her instincts, and right now they were screaming at her that something wasn't right. She moved to the bar, pretending to check on drinks while keeping an eye on the door. That's when she saw it, a flicker of movement outside, shadowed figures in the dim hallway beyond the frosted glass. Her gut twisted. Before she could react, the door to the poker room flew open, and in walked Ricky Chavez, his brother Hector close behind. Sasha McQueen followed, looking every bit as dangerous as she was beautiful, and Dante Brill, all smooth arrogance, bringing up the rear. "Evening, gentlemen," Ricky said, his voice calm but laced with danger. His eyes swept the room, taking in everything in a heartbeat, the players, the guards, the money on the table. He wasn't here for the game. Jackie felt her pulse quicken. She glanced at Frankie, who kept his cool, though she saw the flicker of surprise in his eyes. This wasn't part of the plan. "What the hell is this?" Bruno barked, pushing back from the table, his hand instinctively going toward his jacket. The guards by the door straightened, hands on their weapons. Ricky smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We're not here for the poker. Relax. No one's gonna get hurt if you play along." Frankie leaned back in his chair, his smile never faltering. "And if we don't?" Hector grinned, the kind of grin that made people uncomfortable. He stepped forward, pulling a gun from his waistband and waving it lazily in the air. "Then we start redecorating with a fresh coat of blood." The tension in the room thickened. Jackie's eyes flicked to Sasha, who was watching the scene unfold with a cool detachment, and Dante, who looked like he was already planning his escape route. Ricky's gaze landed on Bruno. "You have something we need, something worth a hell of a lot more than what's on that table." Bruno looked confused for a moment, but it quickly turned to anger. "I don't know what the hell you're talking about." Jackie's heart sank. She could see where this was going. Bruno didn't know it, but he was sitting on something much bigger than cash, the stash of diamonds Dante and Sasha were after. And now Ricky was here to collect. Frankie finally spoke up, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "We're just running a poker game here, fellas. If you've got business with Bruno, take it outside." Ricky's smile faded. "This isn't about Bruno. This is about something you're all tangled up in, whether you like it or not." Jackie felt the weight of Ricky's words sink into the room. She could see Frankie calculating, trying to find the angle, trying to work out if this was salvageable. But before anyone could move, Hector snapped. "You know what? Screw this." Hector's voice was sharp, and in an instant, he slammed the butt of his gun against the side of Bruno's head. The businessman crumpled to the floor, blood trickling down his temple. "Jesus!" one of the guards shouted, reaching for his gun, but Ricky was faster, pulling his own and aiming it directly at the man's chest. "Don't," Ricky said quietly. "We're not here to kill anyone, but we will if we have to." Jackie's mind raced. Everything was spiraling out of control. She needed to get Frankie out, but he was still sitting there, playing it cool like this was just another game. She knew that look. He was waiting for his moment, waiting for the right play, but she wasn't sure there was one this time. Sasha finally spoke, her voice smooth and dangerous. "Let's not make this more complicated than it has to be. We know Bruno has access to the diamonds. We just want them. No one has to die for it." "Yet," Hector added, grinning. Jackie's eyes darted between Frankie and Ricky. They were both calculating, both playing their angles, but it was a ticking time bomb, and someone was bound to blow it. "What's the play here, Frankie?" she whispered, her voice low enough that only he could hear. Frankie's eyes flicked to hers, his expression unreadable. "We're in this now, Red. No backing out." But Jackie knew Frankie, knew that he was already thinking about how to spin this to his advantage. He always had an angle, always a way to twist things in his favor. She just hoped this time it wouldn't get them killed. Dante, meanwhile, leaned casually against the wall, arms crossed. "You guys are really messing up our night here. We were having a nice little con, and now you bring guns into it? No class, man. No class." Sasha shot him a look. "Shut up, Dante." But Dante just grinned. "I'm serious." We were going to take Bruno for all he's worth, and now it's a bloodbath waiting to happen. Jackie felt the tension rise another notch. This was all going to hell fast. And the worst part? She didn't know who to trust. Ricky's crew, Frankie's charm, or her own instincts screaming at her to get out. Ricky's voice broke the silence. Bruno's unconscious, but he's not the key. He's just a stepping stone to the real prize. The diamonds, Frankie said softly, his eyes narrowing. That's what this is really about. Ricky nodded. And you're either with us or you're against us. Make your choice. Frankie looked at Jackie, then back to Ricky, weighing his options. The game wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. But Jackie could see the writing on the wall. This wasn't going to end with everyone walking away rich. Someone was going to end up dead. The question was, who? Chapter 5, The Long Night. The world had a buzz, a constant hum that vibrated through Hector Chavez's bones. His head was swimming in the haze of adrenaline, drugs, and the faint memory of Ricky telling him to keep it together. But keeping it together was the last thing on his mind. Chaos. Now that was more like it. The kind of pure, unfiltered chaos that sent blood rushing through his veins like a bullet shot from a gun. The poker game was a mess, bodies scrambling, guns drawn, and the tension so thick you could taste it. He loved it. Hector wiped a streak of blood from his mouth, unsure whether it was his or someone else's, and scanned the room with eyes wide, wild. He barely registered Ricky's voice, his older brother, always the calm one, always in control, always cleaning up Hector's messes. Get your head straight, Hector. Ricky snapped, his voice cutting through the haze like a cold wind, but Hector couldn't stop grinning. He was barely listening. The aftermath of the botched poker con was unfolding in front of them. Bruno was down, the guards were tense, and Ricky was trying to salvage what was left of the plan. Not that Hector cared. To him, everything was playing out perfectly. It was exactly the kind of night he lived for. Messy, unpredictable, dangerous. He thrived in it. Behind them, Dante was still playing it cool, like the entire scene wasn't unraveling. And Sasha, with her sharp eyes, was assessing everything, including him. Hector could feel her gaze on him, watching, calculating. She was dangerous in her own way. He liked that. Shut the hell up, Ricky. Hector sneered, turning toward his brother. You're always trying to control me. But this is what we do, man. This is what I do. Ricky grabbed him by the arm, pulling him in close, their faces inches apart. Not this time, Hector. You're pushing it too far. But Hector was already beyond that. The drugs were singing in his blood, amplifying everything. The fear, the excitement, the thrill of being on the edge. He shoved Ricky away, laughing. Relax, bro. I've got this. I always do. Ricky's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Sasha slipped between them, her voice smooth, like silk over a blade. Boys, let's not fight. She placed a hand on Hector's arm, her fingers lingering a little too long. Hector's just passionate. Aren't you, sweetheart? Hector turned to her, that grin still plastered on his face, but there was something different now. The way Sasha looked at him, he liked it. She wasn't scared of him. She was playing him, sure, but that didn't bother him. Hell, he was used to being played. The trick was not letting them know you were aware. He leaned in closer, his breath hot against her ear. You like dangerous men, don't you? Sasha chuckled, stepping back, but not too far. I like men who know how to handle themselves. Her gaze flicked to Ricky, then back to Hector. And I think you do. Ricky glared at her, but he didn't say anything. He knew better than to argue when Sasha was involved. She had a way of twisting people up, making them see what they wanted to see. But Hector wasn't fooled. He knew exactly what she was doing, and he didn't care. If anything, it excited him. Sasha was playing the long game, using him to get what she wanted. But tonight, Hector was the one in control. As the tension in the room built, one of Santini's men, a bulky thug named Leo, stepped forward, gun raised. Enough of this shit. You clowns think you can walk in here and take what you want. You've got another thing coming. Hector's eyes flicked to the gun, then to Leo's face. A flash of excitement surged through him. Finally, some real fun. Ricky tried to step in, his voice firm. We're not looking for a body count. Let's all calm down. But Hector was already moving. He lunged forward, knocking the gun out of Leo's hand with a swift slap, his other fist connecting with the man's jaw in a brutal uppercut. Leo staggered back, stunned, but Hector wasn't finished. He pounced, fists flying, the crack of bone against bone echoing through the room as he unleashed all that pent-up rage. The room exploded into chaos again. Sasha stepped back, watching with cool detachment. Dante made a move toward the door, probably hoping to slip out unnoticed. Leo managed to get a punch in, catching Hector across the face, but it only fueled him. Hector grinned through the blood, a savage, twisted smile, and then he was on Leo again, slamming him into the poker table, sending cards and cash flying everywhere. "Hector, stop!" Ricky shouted, but Hector didn't hear him. All he saw was red. He grabbed a broken bottle from the floor, raising it high, ready to drive it into Leo's throat. The room held its breath, the tension snapping into a sharp, deadly edge, and then Sasha stepped in. "Hector," she said, her voice low, calm, cutting through the violence like a whisper in the dark. "Let him go." Hector froze, the bottle trembling in his hand. He could feel the weight of Ricky's stare, but more than that, he felt Sasha's eyes on him. Her voice had a pull, a magnetism that cut through the drugs, through the rage, through everything. She stepped closer, her hand resting gently on his arm, the bottle still raised. "Not yet," she murmured. "Not him. He's not worth it." For a moment, Hector hesitated. His grip on the bottle tightened, his breath coming in ragged bursts. But then, slowly, the tension drained from his muscles. He let the bottle drop to the floor with a dull clink. Leo coughed, scrambling away, blood pouring from his mouth. But Hector didn't care. He stepped back, his chest heaving, his mind still buzzing with violence, but Sasha's hand on his arm anchored him. "Good boy," she whispered, just loud enough for him to hear. Hector's pulse slowed, but the grin never left his face. He was still high on the thrill, the blood, the fear in everyone's eyes. And Sasha had just saved him from taking it too far. For now. Ricky stepped forward, his eyes dark, full of warning. "You're losing it, Hector. You pull something like that again and I'm not bailing you out." Hector wiped the blood from his face, glancing at his brother with a sneer. "You worry too much, man. I've got it handled." But Ricky wasn't convinced. He looked past Hector, straight into Sasha's eyes. "You better be sure of what you're doing, McQueen. You pull his strings wrong, and we all end up dead." Sasha smiled, that dangerous, seductive smile. "I'm always sure, Ricky. The question is, are you?" Hector didn't miss the look that passed between them, the unspoken tension that rippled through the air. But he didn't care. All he knew was that tonight wasn't over, and the real fun was just beginning. He glanced at Sasha one last time, her presence somehow calming and electrifying him all at once. She was using him, he knew that. But in this world, everyone used everyone. It was just a matter of who played the game better. And Hector loved the game. As the night stretched on, the chaos was far from over, and Hector Chavez, with his blood-soaked grin, was ready for whatever came next. Chapter 6. Crossfire. Dante Brill adjusted his cufflinks with a slow, calculated movement, glancing around the chaos with a slight, bemused smile. The poker game had turned into a disaster, a blood-spattered, bullet-riddled mess. But Dante's mind was already racing ahead, spinning possibilities. That's what he did best. Pivot, shift, play all sides until there was only one winner. And Dante always made sure that was him. The stench of blood and sweat filled the room. Ricky was breathing heavily, wiping at the cut on his brow. Hector was still pacing like a caged animal, a grin plastered on his face, clearly reveling in the mayhem. Sasha stood to the side, cool and poised, as if the whole thing was unfolding exactly as she wanted. Maybe it was. She was dangerous like that. Dante had learned not to underestimate her, no matter how disarming that smile of hers could be. But right now, Dante wasn't thinking about Sasha's smile. He was thinking about survival. His own. "Well, that could have gone better," Dante said, stepping over a fallen chair, his voice light. Casual, like he was commenting on the weather and not the body count piling up around them. His smile flashed briefly as he approached Ricky. Ricky barely glanced at him, his mind clearly still racing with everything that had gone wrong. "We're done," Ricky muttered, shaking his head. "This went to hell." Ah, not quite yet, my friend. Dante's voice was smooth, almost comforting. He placed a hand on Ricky's shoulder, lowering his voice so only he could hear. Look, I know it seems like we're up against the wall, but we've still got cards to play. We can salvage this. Ricky gave him a sideways glance, suspicion flickering in his eyes. Dante didn't blame him. In a room like this, trust was as rare as diamonds. But Ricky was desperate, and desperation made people pliable. We go back for the diamonds, Dante continued, his voice dripping with confidence. We finish what we started, but we do it smart this time. No more mistakes, no more unnecessary risks. You really think that's possible? Ricky's tone was skeptical, but Dante could tell he was listening. Of course, Dante replied smoothly. I've got a plan, a way to get us out of this with what we came for. All we need is to regroup, push forward, and make sure we're all on the same page. He shot a quick glance at Hector, still grinning like a lunatic, and Sasha, who was watching them both with that calculating look in her eyes. Especially your brother. We need him under control. Ricky's jaw tightened, his eyes darting toward Hector. It was a sore spot, Dante knew. Ricky had been pulling Hector's messes out of the fire for years, but this was different. This wasn't a bar fight or a bad deal. This was life and death, and it was starting to wear on him. You think I don't know that, Ricky muttered, his voice low. But Hector's a loose cannon. If he goes off again, we're dead. Dante smiled sympathetically, stepping closer. That's why we need to focus on what we can control. And right now, that's the diamonds. He paused, letting his words sink in. We cut Hector in, give him a clear job, something to keep his hands busy. Meanwhile, you and I, we handle the real score. We get out with the diamonds, and we never have to deal with this mess again. Ricky was quiet for a moment, weighing the options. Dante could see the doubt creeping in, but he also saw the glint of something else, hope. Ricky was looking for a way out, just like Dante. He just needed someone to lead him there. You trust her? Ricky asked finally, his eyes flicking toward Sasha. Dante let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. Sasha, trust is a strong word, but I trust her to want those diamonds as badly as we do. She won't screw us until she has what she wants. We just need to stay ahead of her game. It was a delicate balance, one Dante had been walking for years. He knew Sasha too well. She was playing her own game, just like he was. But as long as he stayed one step ahead, he'd come out on top. He always did. Ricky let out a long breath, nodding slightly. Fine, we do it your way, but if this blows up, I'm putting a bullet in your head first. Dante's smile widened. Fair enough. He turned to Sasha, his charm back in full force. We're moving forward. You in? Sasha's eyes flicked between Dante and Ricky, assessing the situation. For a moment, Dante wondered if she'd try to take control, push her own agenda, but then she smiled, that same predatory smile she always used when she was about to get what she wanted. Of course, she purred, stepping forward. I knew you boys would come around. Dante couldn't help but feel a flicker of satisfaction. He had her where he wanted her, for now. He just had to make sure he stayed in control long enough to get the hell out. Behind him, Hector let out a low chuckle, flexing his hands as if he was ready for another fight. Ricky shot him a warning glance, but Hector didn't seem to care. Let's get those diamonds, Hector growled, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of it all. Dante clapped his hands together, the sound cutting through the tension like a knife. All right, people. Time to pull it together. We've got one last shot at this, and we're gonna make it count. He turned on his heel, already moving toward the exit, his mind racing with possibilities. He had spun the situation to his advantage, just like he always did. Now all he had to do was keep Ricky and Hector in line, play Sasha just right, and walk away with the diamonds and his life. As they made their way out of the wrecked poker room, Dante couldn't help but feel a surge of confidence. He was close, so close to getting everything he wanted, and in the end, that was all that mattered. The night was far from over, and Dante Brill was just getting started. Chapter 7. The Con That Almost Was. Frankie's silk Marlowe reclined against the cracked leather seat of the dilapidated booth, a wry smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The dive bar they had stumbled into was the perfect place to regroup, a place where nobody looked too hard at the patrons, and the smoke hung thick enough to hide the tension in the air. Jackie sat across from him, her eyes scanning the room, never staying in one place for too long. Frankie's charm had gotten them out of plenty of scrapes before, but Jackie wasn't the type to rely on luck. She trusted instincts, and right now, her instincts were screaming that something wasn't right. "That went well," Frankie said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He drummed his fingers on the table, his eyes darting to the door every few seconds, keeping his cool facade even as his mind worked overtime. I mean, could have been worse, right? Jackie shot him a look, her expression icy. "You call that well? We were 2 seconds from getting our heads blown off." She leaned in, her voice lowering to a hiss. "This is getting out of hand, Frankie. We need to cut our losses and disappear." Frankie grinned, tilting his head back slightly. "Jackie, you've always been too pragmatic. This is the opportunity of a lifetime. Sure, it got messy back there, but with a crew like this, we can still come out on top." "You think they're gonna let us walk away with a piece of the pie?" Jackie said, narrowing her eyes. "I'm not stupid, Frankie. You think Ricky or that psycho Hector are just gonna hand over the diamonds?" Frankie's smile never faltered, even as Jackie's words hit home. She was right, of course, but Frankie had always played the long game, and he wasn't about to walk away empty-handed. Not when they were so close. "They will if we play this right," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "We've got something they don't, Brains. And you, my dear, are the sharpest person in the room." Jackie raised an eyebrow, unconvinced but not entirely dismissing him. She had been by his side long enough to know Frankie could talk his way into or out of almost anything. But this was different. This was dangerous, and she wasn't sure if Frankie's silver tongue would be enough to keep them alive. Before she could respond, the door to the bar creaked open, and Sasha McQueen stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on Frankie and Jackie. She walked with a confidence that made people move out of her way without even realizing it. The air in the bar seemed to shift as she approached, her heels clicking softly on the worn floorboards. "Look who it is," Frankie said, flashing her a grin as Sasha slid into the booth beside him, her perfume a mix of something exotic and dangerous. "I was starting to think you ditched us, Sasha." Sasha's eyes sparkled with amusement as she leaned back, crossing her legs with practiced ease. "I don't ditch people, Frankie. Not unless I have to." She gave him a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And you're still useful," Frankie chuckled, leaning in slightly. "Well, I'm flattered." Jackie, however, remained stiff, her eyes narrowing at the sight of Sasha. She didn't trust the woman, not one bit. Sasha was the kind of person who had plans within plans, and Jackie had no intention of getting caught in one of them. "We need to talk," Sasha said, her gaze shifting between Frankie and Jackie. "Things are moving fast and we don't have time for games. If you want a piece of the action, you need to pull your weight." "Oh, we'll pull our weight," Frankie said, his voice smooth as ever. "But we want a fair share. None of this getting screwed over at the last-minute business. We're in or we're out." Sasha's lips curled into a smile. "That depends on how useful you make yourselves. Ricky and Dante are already making moves, and if we don't act fast, we'll lose our window." She paused, her eyes locking on Frankie's. "I assume you can still be useful?" Frankie leaned back, his confidence unwavering. "You know I can, Sasha. And Jackie here? She's the best at what she does." He glanced at Jackie, who was watching the exchange carefully, calculating every word. "So, what's the plan?" Sasha took a moment, her eyes flicking to Jackie before she spoke. "We're finishing what we started. Ricky's on board, but Hector's becoming a problem." Her gaze darkened slightly. "We keep him in check, get the diamonds, and get out. I don't care what happens after, as long as I get my cut." Jackie finally spoke up, her voice laced with suspicion. "And what's stopping you from cutting us loose the second you've got what you want?" Sasha's smile was cold, but her eyes never wavered. "What's stopping you from doing the same?" There was a long silence, the tension between the three of them thickening as each one silently calculated their next move. Frankie finally broke the silence, laughing softly. All right, he said, holding up his hands. "Let's not start killing each other before the diamonds are even in our hands." He shot a glance at Jackie, giving her a subtle nod. "We're all professionals here, right?" Jackie crossed her arms, her jaw tight. "Professionals don't get caught in crossfire, Frankie." Sasha leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "That's why we need to move carefully. No more screw-ups. No more. See crossfire." Frankie's smile returned, as charming as ever. You got yourself a deal. We help you get those diamonds, and we all walk away rich. He extended his hand, waiting for Sasha to take it. Sasha glanced at his hand, then at Jackie, before slowly reaching out and shaking it. But if you try to double-cross me, Frankie, she said softly, her eyes sharp as knives, I'll make sure you don't get a second chance. Frankie's grin didn't falter. Wouldn't dream of it. As Sasha stood and walked away, her heels clicking softly once again, Jackie leaned in toward Frankie, her voice low. You realize she's going to screw us over the second she can, right? Frankie's eyes followed Sasha as she disappeared out of the bar. Of course, that's why we'll screw her first. Jackie's eyes narrowed. You've got a plan? Frankie's grin widened. I always do, Jackie. I always do. But as Frankie watched the door close behind Sasha, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. He had played this game 100 times before, but something about this felt different, more dangerous, more unpredictable, and that was when Frankie thrived. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this time, the stakes were higher than ever, and the consequences far deadlier. For now, though, he had Sasha where he wanted her, and as long as they kept playing the game, Frankie knew one thing for sure. He wasn't about to fold. Chapter 8. Into the Wolf's Den. Ricky Bones Chavez sat on the edge of a dingy motel bed, staring out at the neon glow of the sign flickering through the window. His mind raced, but his body remained still, controlled as always. That was his gift, the ability to compartmentalize, to push all the noise aside and focus on the job. But tonight, the noise was deafening. Hector's latest outburst weighed on him like a stone in his chest. His younger brother had always been trouble, but this time it was different. Hector wasn't just reckless, he was unraveling. The drugs, the violence, the constant chaos, Ricky had spent his life cleaning up after Hector, pulling him back from the edge. But now, as they prepared to pull off the biggest job of their lives, Ricky couldn't shake the feeling that Hector was a ticking time bomb. The door creaked open and Hector swaggered in, his eyes bloodshot and wild, the telltale signs of another bender. He was grinning, but there was nothing playful about it. He was amped up, high on something that made his movements jittery and his temper short. You ready, hermano? Hector asked, pacing around the room, his fingers twitching as he lit a cigarette. The smoke curled around his face like a veil, masking the dangerous gleam in his eyes. This is it, the big score. We pull this off and we're untouchable. Ricky didn't respond immediately. He watched his brother, the way Hector's eyes darted around the room, unable to stay still. The kid was wired, unpredictable, and it made Ricky's gut tighten with unease. You've got to cool it, Hector, Ricky said finally, his voice low but firm. This isn't like the other jobs. You can't just go off the rails and expect me to fix it. Hector laughed, a sharp, manic sound that grated against Ricky's nerves. Come on, man, you always say that, but we've never been caught. You're the best at this, Bones. No one can touch us. Ricky stood up, crossing the room in 2 long strides, grabbing Hector by the arm and forcing him to stop pacing. He locked eyes with his brother, his grip tight enough to get Hector's attention. This isn't just about us, Ricky said, his voice deadly serious. We're not the only ones in this. There's Dante, Sasha, Frankie, and Jackie. If you lose it out there, they'll turn on us in a heartbeat. You get that, right? Hector's grin faltered, but only for a moment. He pulled his arm free, scowling as he flicked ash from his cigarette onto the stained carpet. You're worrying too much, hermano. We've got this. Trust me. Ricky clenched his jaw, feeling that familiar frustration rise inside him. He loved his brother, but the loyalty that had kept him tied to Hector for so long was becoming a noose around his neck. How many times could he pull Hector back from the brink? How many times would it be his job to keep them alive? Before Ricky could press further, there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find Sasha standing there, her dark hair falling in loose waves over her shoulders, her lips curled in that seductive, knowing smile. Behind her, Dante leaned casually against the wall, his eyes flicking between Ricky and Hector, always assessing, always calculating. Everything ready, boys? Sasha purred, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. She gave Ricky a long, appraising look before turning her attention to Hector, who grinned at her like a wolf baring its teeth. Ricky's pulse quickened as Sasha moved through the room, her presence electric. He couldn't deny the pull she had over him, the way her every word and gesture seemed designed to draw him in. But he wasn't stupid. He knew there was more to her than what she let on. She was always playing an angle, and he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever game she was playing, he wasn't the only one in her sights. "We're all set," Hector said, lighting another cigarette as he leaned against the wall. "Just waiting on your word." Sasha's eyes flicked back to Ricky, and for a brief moment, something flashed across her face, something sharp and calculating. She was dangerous, but not in the way Hector was. She didn't need drugs or violence to be lethal. She used her charm, her intelligence, her ability to manipulate people like pieces on a chessboard. And Ricky was starting to realize just how deep her plans ran. "We hit Santini's warehouse tonight," Sasha said, her voice smooth and controlled. "The diamonds are in a secure vault, but I've got access. We'll be in and out before anyone even knows we're there." Dante finally spoke up, his voice easy and relaxed. "Yeah, and when the heat comes down, we're long gone. Simple, clean, no mess." Ricky crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. "And what about Hector?" Hector bristled, pushing off the wall and glaring at Ricky. "What about me? I'm in this just like you." "That's what I'm worried about," Ricky said evenly. "You can't go rogue on this, Hector. You follow the plan, or we're all dead." Sasha stepped between them, her smile sharp as a knife. "Relax, boys. Everything's under control." She turned to Ricky, her voice dropping to a whisper only he could hear. "You trust me, don't you?" Ricky's heart raced, torn between his instinct to protect Hector and the dangerous allure of Sasha. He wanted to believe her, but deep down, he knew she was playing a much bigger game. As Sasha moved closer, her hand brushing lightly against Ricky's arm, he caught a flicker of something in her eyes. Something darker, more calculating. It wasn't just about the diamonds for her. It was about power, control. She wasn't just after the money. She was making a play for Santini's empire. Ricky's mind raced as he realized the full scope of what Sasha was trying to pull off. The diamonds were just the beginning. She wanted to take Santini's place, to seize control of everything he had built. And she was using all of them, Ricky, Hector, Dante, Frankie, Jackie, as pawns in her game. "You're going to want to stay close to me tonight," Sasha whispered, her lips inches from Ricky's ear. "It's about to get interesting." Ricky felt a chill run down his spine, but he didn't pull away. He couldn't. He was already in too deep. As the crew gathered their gear and prepared to move out, Ricky glanced over at Hector, who was grinning like a madman, oblivious to the dangers swirling around them. And in that moment, Ricky realized the truth. This wasn't about protecting Hector anymore. It was about surviving the night. Hector the Wolf Chavez could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, every nerve on fire. The night was hot and thick with tension, but all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart, a steady drumbeat in his ears. The crew moved in silence, creeping through the shadows toward Santini's warehouse, but Hector was barely holding it together. His body buzzed with the aftershocks of whatever cocktail of drugs he'd taken earlier, his mind spinning in 100 directions at once. To Hector, the job didn't matter. The diamonds didn't matter. All that mattered was the rush, the violent release that came when things went sideways. He lived for the chaos, the unpredictability, and tonight was no different. The plan was simple: get in, get the diamonds, get out. But Hector had never been one for plans. The night air felt electric, like the calm before a storm. Hector grinned, his pulse quickening as he saw the warehouse come into view. The crew was silent, too silent. Ricky, always the composed one, led the way, his eyes scanning the perimeter, his jaw clenched in that grim professional way Hector had come to resent. As they reached the entrance, Sasha motioned for everyone to stop. She pulled out the key card she'd acquired, flashing a wicked smile at Hector as she slid it through the reader. The door clicked open with a soft beep, and they slipped inside, moving like ghosts through the dimly lit corridors. Hector could feel it, the tension, the anticipation. His skin prickled, and his hands itched for action. He wanted to break something, to smash the silence that wrapped around them like a suffocating blanket. "Keep it cool, hermano," Ricky whispered, his eyes locking with Hector's for just a second. "We stick to the plan, we're out clean." But Hector wasn't listening. He hadn't been listening for a while. They moved deeper into the warehouse, navigating the maze of steel and concrete. Hector's breathing grew shallow, his hands twitching with every step. The others, Ricky, Sasha, Dante, Frankie, and Jackie, moved with purpose, their focus on the prize. But for Hector, every shadow held a threat, every sound a challenge. He could feel it building inside him, the need to let loose, to tear something apart. And then they reached the vault. Reggie stepped forward, his hands moving quickly over the keypad, fingers dancing across the controls with practiced ease. "Just a minute," he muttered under his breath, his focus absolute. Hector stood behind him, watching the vault door, his blood boiling beneath his skin. He could feel it, the violence brewing, the storm rising inside him. It clawed at his insides, begging to be unleashed. Come on," Reggie whispered as the keypad beeped in response to his efforts. Hector glanced at Sasha, who was standing just behind Ricky, her eyes flicking between the vault and the exit. She was always so calm, so in control, it made Hector sick. She wasn't like him. None of them were. Suddenly, the soft sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Hector's head snapped toward the sound, his pulse skyrocketing. It wasn't one of theirs, it was someone else, Santini's men. "Shit!" Ricky hissed under his breath, his eyes narrowing as he gestured for everyone to get down. "They're here!" For a moment, everything froze. The crew crouched in the shadows, hearts pounding as the footsteps drew closer. Hector's fingers tightened around the grip of his gun, his body coiled like a spring ready to explode. "Stick to the plan," Ricky whispered, his voice tense but controlled. "Wait for them to pass." But Hector couldn't wait. As the first of Santini's men rounded the corner, Hector lunged forward without thinking. His gun was out before anyone could stop him, and in an instant the silence shattered. The first shot echoed through the warehouse like a bomb. Blood sprayed the walls as Hector unloaded his clip into the closest thug, his face twisted into a maniacal grin. The man dropped to the ground, his body crumpling in a lifeless heap. "Hector!" Ricky shouted, scrambling to grab his brother, but it was too late. The sound of gunfire exploded around them as more of Santini's men stormed into the room, their guns blazing. Hector was already in the thick of it, a wild animal unleashed, his every movement erratic and violent. He didn't care about the plan. He didn't care about the diamonds. He wanted blood. Ricky ducked behind a stack of crates, firing off a few shots in an attempt to keep Santini's men at bay, but his focus was on Hector. His brother had lost it completely, charging through the gunfire like a madman, shooting and screaming, completely oblivious to the danger. "Hector, get back!" Ricky yelled, but Hector was too far gone. One of Santini's top men, a hulking enforcer with a scar down the side of his face, charged at Hector, swinging a metal pipe with deadly precision. Hector barely dodged the blow, his eyes wild as he grinned, blood spattering across his face. "Come on, you piece of shit!" Hector taunted, his voice dripping with unhinged glee. The enforcer swung again, but Hector was faster. He ducked under the pipe and rammed his knife into the man's side, twisting it viciously. The enforcer gasped, his eyes wide with shock as Hector yanked the knife free and plunged it into his chest again and again and again. By the time Hector was finished, the man was a bloody heap on the ground. But it wasn't enough. Hector turned toward the remaining guards, his bloodlust far from sated. He charged at them, gun raised, his face a mask of crazed fury. Ricky watched in horror as his brother unloaded his clip into the nearest guard, the bullets tearing through flesh and bone with sickening ease. Ricky felt his stomach churn as Hector let out a wild laugh, the sound of it echoing through the chaos. His brother wasn't just reckless, he was dangerous. Unstoppable. And in that moment, Ricky realized something terrifying. He couldn't control Hector anymore. Santini's men were dropping like flies, but they weren't going down without a fight. Ricky and the rest of the crew ducked for cover as bullets whizzed past them, the warehouse quickly becoming a war zone. Frankie and Jackie exchanged frantic looks, their hands moving to their weapons, while Dante crouched low, trying to stay out of the line of fire. "This is going to shit real fast," Dante muttered, his eyes darting toward Sasha, who remained eerily calm in the middle of the chaos. Ricky couldn't focus on anything but Hector. He had to stop him. He had to bring him back before they all ended up dead. But as Ricky moved to grab his brother, Hector whirled around, his blood-soaked face grinning like a madman. "You see this, Bones?" Hector shouted over the gunfire, his voice raw and wild. "This is what we were made for." Ricky's heart sank. Hector was too far gone. Before he could say anything, another wave of Santini's men stormed into the warehouse, guns blazing. Ricky cursed under his breath, diving behind a stack of crates as bullets tore through the air. He fired off a few shots, trying to keep them at bay, but it was clear they were outnumbered. And Hector was the reason it had all gone to hell. In the midst of the chaos, Ricky locked eyes with Sasha. She was watching him closely, her expression unreadable. For a brief moment, Ricky thought he saw a flicker of satisfaction in her eyes, as if this was exactly what she'd been waiting for. But he couldn't think about that now. Hector had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. Chapter 10, The Heist That Never Was. Jackie Red O'Hara watched the chaos unfold from the shadows, her sharp eyes flicking between the players in this deadly game. The warehouse was a storm of gunfire, bodies dropping, blood spilling, but all she could think about was how quickly things had spiraled out of control. This was supposed to be easy, a quick con, some fast cash, and then disappearing into the night with Frankie. But now, they were neck deep in a mess that was no longer just about diamonds. It was about survival. She could hear Frankie's voice somewhere nearby, smooth as silk even in the midst of this disaster. He was always talking, always negotiating. It was his way, but Jackie knew better. She knew when the con had turned sour, and this one was rotten to the core. The plan had been simple. A fake poker game to fleece a mob-connected businessman, take the diamonds and disappear. But then Ricky, Hector, and their crew had shown up, guns blazing, turning what should have been a carefully orchestrated con into a bloodbath. And now Frankie was doing what he did best, trying to talk his way out of a bullet. "Come on, baby." Frankie's voice echoed from behind a stack of crates, his tone dripping with charm. "We're all in this together. There's no reason we can't all walk away from this with something. Sasha, you're a smart woman. You know better than anyone. Split the score, and we all live to play another day." Jackie rolled her eyes from where she was crouched behind a steel beam, clutching her gun tightly. Frankie was always the optimist, always believing he could sweet-talk his way out of any situation. But this was different. This wasn't just a game anymore. It wasn't just money or diamonds. This was a war zone, and the only people walking away from this were the ones who didn't hesitate to pull the trigger. She peered around the edge of the beam, catching a glimpse of Sasha standing tall amidst the chaos, her face as cold and unreadable as ever. Sasha was calculating, always 5 steps ahead of everyone else, and Jackie could see that Frankie's usual tricks weren't going to work on her. Not this time. "Frankie," Sasha's voice cut through the noise like a blade, sharp and cold. "You think you can charm me into splitting the diamonds? After everything? You're dumber than I thought." Jackie's grip tightened on her gun as she watched the exchange. She could see the wheels turning in Sasha's mind, her cold blue eyes scanning the room, already figuring out her next move. Frankie was in over his head. Hell, they all were. But Jackie wasn't going to stick around and wait to see how it ended. As the gunfire rattled on in the background, Jackie made a decision. She wasn't about to go down with Frankie's sinking ship. He was good, sure, charming, slick, and always talking. But charm wasn't going to save him from what was coming next. And Jackie had learned a long time ago that when a con started going bad, you cut your losses and get out. She looked down at the small bag at her side, the stash of diamonds she'd managed to scoop up in the chaos. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. Enough to disappear. Enough to start over somewhere far away from the blood-soaked streets and the chaos that always seemed to follow her. Frankie, still trying to work his magic, was backing away from Sasha, his hands raised in mock surrender, a lazy grin on his face. "Look, Sasha, we don't have to do this. You and me, we could make a good team. Hell, we could even cut Ricky in, make it a clean 3-way split. Everyone wins." Sasha's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a dangerous smile. "The problem, Frankie, is that I don't like sharing." And that was it. Jackie knew in that moment that Frankie wasn't getting out of this alive. Sasha had already made up her mind. She was playing everyone, as she always did, and Jackie wasn't about to be her next pawn. Taking a deep breath, Jackie slid her gun back into its holster and adjusted the strap of the diamond-stuffed bag over her shoulder. It was time. She wasn't going to wait for the bullets to fly. As quietly as she could, she slipped away from the chaos, moving toward the warehouse's back exit. Her heartbeat quickened with every step, but she kept her breathing steady, her mind clear. Frankie might have been her partner, but Jackie had learned long ago that in this life, There were no partners, just people you used until you didn't need them anymore. And Frankie had just run out of use. She paused by the door, glancing back one last time. Frankie was still talking, still trying to smooth talk his way out of the mess he'd created. But Sasha's icy gaze was fixed on him like a predator about to pounce. Ricky was nearby, wrestling with Hector's madness, and Dante was nowhere to be seen, probably scheming his own escape route. For a moment, Jackie felt a pang of regret. She'd been through a lot with Frankie. He'd always made her laugh, always made things seem easier than they really were. But this wasn't about laughter or loyalty. This was about survival, and Jackie was a survivor. Without a sound, she slipped through the door and into the night, leaving the chaos behind her. The cool night air hit her face as she stepped out into the alley, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't look back. There was no need. She had what she came for, and she wasn't going to wait around to see who was left standing when the dust settled. As she made her way down the dark, empty street, her mind raced with possibilities. She could disappear, lay low for a while, and no one would ever find her. She could sell the diamonds, start fresh somewhere far away from all the violence and betrayal. Maybe this time she'd find a way out for good. But as she walked into the night, a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. She knew, deep down, that she wasn't done yet. There was always another score, always another con. And Jackie Red O'Hara wasn't about to let the game end here. Chapter 11, No Way Out. Ricky Bones Chavez stared down the barrel of his gun, sweat dripping from his brow, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The room was thick with the scent of gunpowder and blood. Hector stood next to him, wild-eyed, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Ricky could feel it, the tension between them, the chaos swirling all around. This was the moment it all came down to, the moment he'd been trying to avoid for as long as he could remember. But there was no way out, not anymore. Across the room, Marcus Santini stood, calm as a king surveying his kingdom. His dark, cold eyes flicked from Ricky to Hector, a small smirk playing on his lips. Behind him, Sasha McQueen stood tall, a picture of deadly beauty. Her lips curled into that same familiar smile Ricky had fallen for once before. She'd played him. She'd played them all. You really thought you could get away with this? Santini's voice was calm, almost amused. You thought you could walk in here, take what's mine, and just disappear into the night? Ricky tightened his grip on the gun, his mind racing. He wasn't here for the diamonds anymore. That had all gone out the window the moment Sasha had walked back into his life. Now, it was about survival, about getting out with his brother alive. But looking at Hector, his hands shaking, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts, Ricky knew it wasn't going to be that simple. Was it all a setup, Sasha? Ricky's voice was low, grating against the tension in the air. He wasn't sure if he even wanted to hear the answer. From the beginning? Sasha's eyes flicked toward him, a faint trace of regret ghosting over her face before it hardened. You know the score, Ricky. There's always someone pulling the strings, always someone bigger than you, bigger than me. She took a step forward, her eyes never leaving his. I tried to help you. I tried to bring you in, but you wanted out. There is no out. Hector laughed, a wild, unhinged sound that echoed in the empty warehouse. See, Ricky, I told you she was playing us, told you there was no walking away from this. He waved his gun erratically, his finger twitching dangerously on the trigger. We're in it, brother, in it till the end. Ricky's chest tightened, the weight of his brother's words crashing down on him. Hector had always been a mess, always dragging him into situations like this. But this was different. They weren't going to walk away from this one. Shut up, Hector. Ricky's voice was sharp, cutting through the madness. He couldn't afford to lose control, not now. Listen to your brother, Hector. Santini's smooth voice slithered through the room. He's the smart one. He knows how this ends. You've got two options, boys. Either you hand over those diamonds, or you can join the others in the ground. Ricky's eyes darted to the bag of diamonds lying on the ground near Sasha's feet. The prize they'd all been after. The prize that had cost so many lives, so much blood. But now, it felt meaningless, worthless. It wasn't about the diamonds anymore. It was about survival, about escaping this nightmare with what little was left of his soul. Sasha took another step forward, her gaze locking with Ricky's. You don't have to die here, Ricky. You can walk away. We can still make this work. For a moment, Ricky hesitated. He could hear the promise in her voice, the allure of escape, of something more. But then he saw it, the glint in her eye, the cold calculation behind her words. She wasn't offering him salvation. She was offering him a cage. You really think I'm that stupid? Ricky's voice was low, laced with bitterness. You've been using us from the start. Hector, me, all of it. This was never about the diamonds. Sasha's smile faltered for the briefest of moments. You don't understand. No, I understand perfectly. Ricky cut her off, his eyes narrowing. You're working with him. He nodded toward Santini. You've been working with him the whole time, and now you're trying to tie up the loose ends. Sasha's eyes flashed with something unreadable, but before she could respond, Hector let out a wild shout, raising his gun toward Santini. Hector, no! Ricky lunged for his brother, but it was too late. A gunshot rang out, echoing through the warehouse. Ricky watched in horror as Hector's body jerked, a crimson bloom spreading across his chest. He staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock, before crumpling to the ground. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Ricky's breath caught in his throat, his entire world narrowing to the sight of his brother's lifeless body on the ground. Hector was gone. Santini lowered his gun, a cold smirk playing on his lips. Told you, Ricky, you're smart. You should have walked away. Something inside Ricky snapped. All the anger, all the guilt, all the regret, it boiled over, consuming him in a fiery rage. Without thinking, he raised his gun and fired. The bullet caught Santini in the chest, wiping the smirk from his face as he staggered back, blood pouring from the wound. He fell to the ground with a thud, his eyes wide with shock. The warehouse was silent, save for the sound of Ricky's ragged breathing. He stared at Santini's lifeless body, his heart pounding in his chest. It was over. But then, he felt Sasha's presence behind him. You didn't have to do that, she said softly, her voice laced with something that sounded almost like disappointment. Ricky didn't turn around. He couldn't, not yet. You're going to take the diamonds, aren't you? His voice was hoarse, hollow. Sasha didn't respond immediately, but he could feel her cold, calculating gaze on his back. You know how this works, Ricky. I have to look out for myself, and I gave you the chance to come with me. Ricky closed his eyes, the weight of everything crushing down on him. He'd lost Hector. He'd lost everything. And for what? A bag of diamonds? A woman who had played him from the start? Go, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Just go. Sasha didn't hesitate. She scooped up the bag of diamonds and turned, walking away without a second glance. Her footsteps echoed through the warehouse, fading into the distance until she was gone. Ricky stood there, staring at the spot where his brother had fallen, his heart heavy with grief and regret. He had nothing left, no way out. And yet, as he stood in the cold, empty warehouse, he couldn't help but wonder, was there ever really a way out? Chapter 12, The Final Curtain. Frankie Silk Marlowe had always prided himself on staying one step ahead. The smooth-talking grifter who could walk into any room, any situation, and leave with more than he came with. But tonight, that charm was wearing thin, and as the cold air of the warehouse hit his face, he realized just how deep the hole he had dug himself was. The warehouse was a mess of blood, broken glass, and the faint echo of gunshots still reverberating in the silence. Bodies littered the floor, Santini's men, Ricky's crew, and scattered debris that told the story of the chaos that had unfolded just moments before. Frankie had managed to keep himself out of the line of fire, just barely, but now there was no more hiding. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his fingers shaking as they gripped the gun in his hand. For once in his life, the con wasn't going according to plan. His mind raced, calculating, always calculating. There was still a chance. There had to be. All the blood, all the betrayals, it couldn't end like this. Not for Frankie. Across the room he saw her, Sasha McQueen. The dangerous femme fatale with the blood of a dozen men on her hands and the diamonds stashed in the bag at her feet. She was cold, calm, every bit the viper Frankie knew her to be. And yet, even now, there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Calculation, maybe even fear. You're not getting out of this one, Sasha, Frankie called out, his voice slick with desperation, but still carrying that old charm. You played everyone, yeah, but you can't play me. Not anymore. Sasha's eyes flicked toward him, but she didn't flinch. She never did. Frankie, you should have stayed out of this. You were always better at small-time cons. Her voice was cold, dismissive, as if the bodies lying around them were nothing more than props in a play. Frankie edged closer, his heart pounding in his chest. Maybe, but even small-time cons end with a payout, and you owe me, Sasha. We were supposed to split the score, remember? She laughed, a sharp, dangerous sound that echoed through the empty space. You really believed that, didn't you? She stepped over the body of one of Santini's men, the diamonds glistening in the bag she clutched in her hand. You've always been too trusting, Frankie. That's your problem. Frankie swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room. Ricky was still there, standing over Hector's body, silent and defeated. Dante was gone, either dead or smart enough to have made a run for it. But Frankie couldn't think about them now. All that mattered was the bag, the diamonds. His way out. Sasha, he called again, his voice lower now, almost pleading. You and me, we can still make this work. We can split the diamonds, disappear. No one else has to die. Her eyes flashed, and for a moment, he thought she might actually consider it. But then that cold smile returned to her lips, and Frankie's heart sank. You're right about one thing, Frankie, she said, her voice soft, almost tender. No one else has to die. But that doesn't include you. Before Frankie could react, Sasha moved like a shadow, her gun raised and fired. The bullet hit Frankie square in the chest, knocking the wind out of him as he staggered back, his legs giving out beneath him. He hit the cold concrete floor with a thud, his hand instinctively clutching at the wound. Blood poured from the hole in his chest, warm and sticky, pooling beneath him as his vision began to blur. The pain was sharp at first, but then, like everything else, it began to fade. Frankie gasped for air, his thoughts scrambling for one last con, one last trick. But there was nothing. The game was over. Sasha approached him slowly, standing over him with that same icy calm. I told you, Frankie, you were always better at the small time. He tried to speak, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. His fingers twitched, reaching for the gun that lay just out of his grasp, but he knew it was useless. Don't feel bad, Sasha continued, kneeling down beside him, her voice almost comforting now. You were good, Frankie. You just picked the wrong side. The warehouse was deathly silent as Sasha stood up, the diamonds in hand, and walked away without looking back. Frankie lay there, staring up at the ceiling, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He could feel the life draining from him, his heartbeat slowing with each passing second. The con was over. The final curtain was falling. As the darkness closed in, Frankie's last thought was a bitter one. He'd always thought he could talk his way out of anything. But not this time. Epilogue. Ghosts in the desert. Ricky Bones Chavez drove through the barren desert, the empty highway stretching out in front of him like an endless road to nowhere. The engine's steady hum was the only sound, aside from the wind whipping dust across the cracked asphalt. The sun hung low on the horizon, bleeding shades of orange and red into the sky, colors that reminded him too much of blood. The passenger seat was empty, but the weight of Hector's absence pressed down on Ricky like an anvil. His brother's body was in the back, wrapped in a cheap blanket, lifeless. Hector had always been reckless, always too far gone to be saved. Ricky had tried, God knows he had, but the pull of violence, drugs, and chaos had been too strong. And now, Hector was nothing more than a ghost, another casualty in a life filled with them. Ricky's own body ached. The gunshot wounds, the bruises, the scars, both physical and mental, they all reminded him of just how close he had come to joining Hector in that makeshift grave in the back. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, the leather slick beneath his fingers. He was alive, but barely. And for what? The heist had been a disaster from the start. He should have known. Sasha had played him, just like she played everyone else. Ricky had always prided himself on being the smart one, the one who could see through the lies, the double crosses, the schemes. But he hadn't seen Sasha coming. Or maybe he had, but he didn't care. She had that way about her, dangerous, seductive, a woman you knew would burn you but made you want to get close anyway. Now she was gone, and so were the diamonds. Ricky's thoughts drifted, replaying the moments leading up to the final bloodbath. Sasha, always one step ahead. Frankie, lying in a pool of his own blood, believing up until the last moment that he could talk his way out of anything. Dante had vanished, probably dead too, if Sasha had anything to say about it. And the others. Well, they were just more bodies in a long line of bodies that littered Ricky's path through life. The road stretched out, a never-ending line in the desert. Ricky's eyes burned, dry from the wind, but also from the weight of everything that had happened. His chest tightened as memories flashed through his mind. Hector's wild grin as he swung a gun around, the sound of gunfire echoing off concrete walls, the way Sasha's lips curved into that deadly smile when she knew she had won. What the hell am I doing? Ricky thought. He had wanted out. For so long he had dreamed of getting away from the life, the blood, the violence. But no matter how far he ran, no matter how many jobs he finished, he always found himself back in the same place, on the wrong side of a gun, chasing ghosts in the desert. Maybe that was it. Maybe there was no escaping it. Maybe men like him, men like Hector, were born to live and die by the gun. Ricky had spent years trying to protect his brother, to keep him from falling deeper into the abyss. But in the end, it didn't matter. Hector had made his choice, and so had Ricky. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the desert floor. It felt fitting somehow, like the end of something, or maybe just the beginning of another cycle. Ricky's hands trembled as he reached for a cigarette, lighting it with one hand as he steered the car down the empty road. He took a long drag, letting the smoke fill his lungs, feeling the burn. It was familiar, comforting in a way. It reminded him of all the bars he'd sat in, all the deals gone wrong, all the nights spent wondering if he'd make it to morning. As the last light of the day faded into dusk, Ricky glanced in the rearview mirror. Hector's body was still there, still wrapped in that blanket. A reminder of everything Ricky had lost. Of everything he couldn't save. But it wasn't just Hector's ghost haunting him. It was everyone. Sasha, Frankie, Dante, even the faceless men whose lives he'd taken over the years. They were all there, sitting in the back seat with Hector, staring at Ricky through the cracked mirror, asking the same question over and over again. What now? Ricky didn't have an answer. He wasn't sure if there even was one. He flicked the cigarette out the window, watching as the glowing ember tumbled into the dust. The road stretched on, endless, leading nowhere and everywhere all at once. He was alive, but for how long? And what did it even matter? Men like him didn't get happy endings. They didn't get to ride off into the sunset with bags full of diamonds and a new life waiting for them. They got death. Or worse, they got to keep living, carrying the weight of all the bodies they'd left behind. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the desert was plunged into darkness. Ricky drove on, the headlights cutting through the night, the only light left in a world full of shadows. He wasn't sure where he was going. He wasn't sure if it mattered. All he knew was that the ghosts would follow him. And no matter how far he drove, no matter how many times he tried to leave, the violence would always pull him back. It always did. The end.